Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to talk today about our dysfunctional, excuse me if I don't make as much eye contact with everybody, but I only have these two eyes, about our dysfunctional relationship to food in this country. Has anyone heard of an eating disorder called orthorexia? Well, it's not official yet, it's not on the DSM yet, but it's an unhealthy obsession with healthy eating. And more Americans suffer from orthorexia. And I want to help you avoid that fate. There's a very strange thing going on with food in our country. We obsess about nutrition. We read all the articles and the studies, and we are a people who know about 2 different kinds of cholesterol, soon to be about 4, and we know about antioxidants a little bit, and we know about, we know all these words, all this biochemistry. Yet we don't know how to eat. And we are, of the people on this planet, we probably are the most obsessed with nutrition, and we probably have the worst dietary health. We have, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, estimates that of the $2 trillion we're spending on healthcare in this country, 1.5 trillion, 3/4 of it, goes to treat preventable chronic disease. Now that includes smoking and drinking, but food, by and large, is right in there. And I call it the American paradox. We've all heard of the French paradox, which is the one you want to have. I mean, these, people who, eat all this supposedly lethal food, triple creme cheeses and foie gras and all this saturated fat in various forms washed down with lots of red wine, and they're healthier than we are, and we scratch our heads, and how could that be? Well, the American paradox is of people who worry a lot about nutrition, don't eat any of that stuff, or say they don't, and nevertheless have really lousy dietary health. I want to sort of figure out how did we get here, and how could we break out of this way of thinking about food, and that's really what I'm going to talk about tonight. I think a big part of our problem is the way we look at food, the ideology we bring to the understanding of food. Now, ideology is a big fancy word for basically the unspoken assumptions that undergird our understanding of anything. And we have an ideology of food that I call nutritionism. Now, it's not the science of nutrition, even though it's built on that. It is the ideology of looking at food through a pseudo-scientific lens. And I'll explain why I think it's pseudo as we go on. Now, let me describe the 4 tenets of this ideology. And you tell me if it doesn't kind of reflect either your unspoken assumptions about food or the cultures at large. The first tenet of nutritionism is that what's important in food is the nutrient. And that's why I call it nutritionism. That foods are essentially the sum of their nutrient parts, and what really matters about a food is not that it's broccoli or steak or ice cream, but the fats and the carbohydrates and the proteins and the antioxidants and the vitamins, all those invisible things. Food is essentially a delivery system for nutrients. It's kind of this crude carrier of the important thing called nutrients. That's premise number 1. And if you go around the supermarket today, you will see the names of more nutrients than foods. Even the cereal is talking to you about vitamin D and fiber and whole grains, and nutrients are taking over from food, slowly but surely. Second premise of nutritionism follows from the first. If what matters in food is invisible, and who has ever seen a nutrient? Who's ever tasted a nutrient? Well, if what matters in food is invisible, then you need a priesthood to tell you how to eat. You need experts. It's a lot like a religion. If what matters is not the visible, sensible world, then you need a go-between to help you know how to eat. And certainly we are a culture who now thinks we need experts. We need doctors. We need government food pyramids and dietary guidelines. We need writers. We need all different kinds of people to tell us how to do this very straightforward thing. I mean, I can't think of another species on this planet that relies on expert advice for eating. Can you? So that's premise number 2. Also, premise number 3 is that the world can be divided, and this is true of so many ideologies, into good and evil, right? You have this Manichaean struggle. And in the case of nutritionism, it's the good nutrient against the evil nutrient. And at any given time in our dietary history, we have nutrients at war. So today, there's always a nutrient that we're celebrating, and if you just get enough of it, whether it's, I don't know, what's the nutrient of the moment? What's a nutrient that if you get enough of, you'll live forever? Omega-3 fatty acids, fiber, vitamins, right? These are good nutrients. You get enough of them, you'll live forever. And then on the other side, there's always some nutrient we are trying, the satanic nutrient that we're trying to drive from the food supply. What's the satanic nutrient today? Trans fats. Yeah, that's a really evil nutrient. Saturated fats, really, really bad. Refined carbohydrates, high fructose corn syrup. So eating is a matter of navigating between the Scylla and Charybdis of the good nutrients and the bad nutrients, and that's the challenge. The only problem is the identity of the good ones and the bad ones is switching every few years, and that really is troubling. If you go back 100 years to the first flowering of food faddism in America, I'm talking about John Harvey Kellogg and his famous Battle Creek Sanitarium, you will find that then they were talking the same way about food. They had this nutritionism idea going then, but the evil nutrient then was protein. You had to get protein out of your diet, which is why we have breakfast cereal. That was the food that drove protein out of the morning meal, and that's why Kellogg invented it. And carbohydrates were pure and white and good, and protein was evil. It promoted masturbation and toxins in the digestive system. So you had to get all the protein out of your diet. So that's point 3, that the world is divided into good and evil nutrients. The third point, and this will seem perhaps completely uncontroversial, is that the whole point of eating is health. When you eat, you're either promoting your health or you're ruining your health, but that's what that transaction is all about. Now, most Americans kind of accept that, but it's worth remembering that there have been a great many cultures who've looked at food in a very different way. And food was about things like, community, something you did with family, friends, even enemies. You broke bread with enemies. So food was about social life, not just biology. Food has been about identity. How many people do we know that use their dietary habits as a way to express who they are? Teenagers, of course, do this especially. I'm a vegetarian, I'm a vegan, I'm a pescatarian, I'm a flexitarian, what all the Aryans, you can be. Just looking for my water. Spirituality. Food has been tied to almost all of the great religions have had ceremonies that involve food. So food is a way to engage with God. Food is a way to engage with nature. So food has had a great many other functions and meanings, and we've reduced all these to this one narrow idea. It's all about health. And the odd thing, and the thing to keep in mind, is many of the people who don't look at food the way we do are healthier than we are. So obsessing about the healthfulness of food does not necessarily mean you'll be healthier. So that's nutritionism. And I would say that pretty much characterizes the American way of looking at food. And I want to try to dislodge this from your thinking about food over the next few minutes. Now, where did it come from? I don't want to go into great detail about the history, but it's got an old history. I mentioned that it was going on for John Harvey Kellogg. And even in the 19th century, you have Americans talking about scientific eating as if they knew what it was. And so we've always had this idea, and I think it comes out of our Puritan heritage, that for food to be about pleasure wasn't good enough. It really had to be about nutrition. So it has an old history, but it has a modern history that I would date to the 70s. And there's one event then in the 70s I just want to mention, because I think that this really was the turning point. And this was in 1977, and there are many of you here who will remember the general outlines of this. And that was when Senator George McGovern chaired a committee, a Senate Select Committee on Nutrition. And he decided it would be a good idea to look at the question of why there was so much heart disease in America and the beginnings of problems with obesity and stroke as well. And he held hearings on the American diet. And he held 2 days of hearings, and then his staff went off and wrote something called the Dietary Guidelines of the United States. It was the first time that the government spoke to us about what we should be eating. Before then, there had been dietary guidelines, but for specific at-risk populations. This was the first time that the government set out to say something and really change all our diets. And it was not controversial advice at the time, you wouldn't think. It was the consensus. And the consensus in those days was that animal fats produced heart disease. And this had been an idea floating around since the 50s. Heart disease had gone way down during World War II, during rationing, and people assumed it was because people weren't getting meat. They didn't look at some of the other things people weren't getting at that time, but, and the fact that people were more physically active, but they focused on this idea of meat. And we had some preliminary evidence that cholesterol was tied to heart disease and food had cholesterol in it. And the science actually was pretty sketchy, but it was enough for McGovern and his committee. And they issued these guidelines which said things like, and this is a kind of a paradigmatic sentence from these guidelines, eat less red meat. And they actually published this as a dietary guideline in the United States. Well, as you can imagine, the beef industry went nuts. They were so upset by this that they brought the full force of all their lobbying muscle to bear on Congress and actually forced McGovern to withdraw the dietary guidelines of the United States because it was damaging to the cattle industry, which happened to be very powerful in his state. A lot of cattle ranchers in South Dakota. And McGovern and his committee took this under advisement, actually renegotiated the dietary guidelines with industry, and that sentence that I just recited, eat less red meat, was rewritten as follows. And I'm just going to dwell on these two sentences, because in the transition from that one way of talking about food to this new way of talking about food is, I think, the rise of nutritionism as the official way to think about food. So eat less red meat, a sentence that George Orwell would approve for its clarity and simplicity and use of words that everyone understands, was changed to choose meats that will reduce your saturated fat intake. Okay? Now, in one way it says the same thing, but in many ways it does not. First of all, especially at that time, nobody knew what saturated fat was. And the industry loved that. It was confusing. That was a big plus. Second point, it takes a negative, an eat less message, and turns it into an affirmative. Choose meats that will have less of the bad nutrient. So you can eat more as long as you're not getting the bad nutrient. And you had, well, I'll talk about what happens to meat after this. So it's an eat more message. And since that date, the government has never, ever been allowed to say, eat less of anything. They're just not allowed. The industry will not permit it. And you have to keep that in mind, that whatever the government tells you about food is compromised by the need to negotiate it with the industry. So we've gone from a negative message, eat less, to an eat more message. And the third thing is, we're not talking about food. We're not talking about meat, something everyone understands. We're talking about nutrients. And industry basically said, you can talk about nutrients all you want, just don't talk about whole foods. And that indeed became the official language. And every subsequent report on diet and health has been cast in the language of nutrients. And there was a cancer report, Diet and Cancer, a couple years later, 1982. And even though all the science they had correlated whole foods, vegetables, and fruits with a reduction of cancer, protective effect on cancer, they didn't talk about that. They talked about beta-carotene and vitamin C and vitamin E, even though there was no science actually proving that those nutrients were the effect. But that's how you had to talk about food. So this is a real watershed in America, and we are still living under the aegis of this idea. And it changed the whole food system. Beginning with that pronouncement, the food industry decided they could really get with this nutritionism, that this would be a really good way to sell more food. So this is the first example of a brilliant kind of jiu-jitsu move on the part of the American food industry to take a criticism, which is what this was. You know, McGovern was saying, The way we're eating is making us sick. We should change the way we eat. And they turned this into a brilliant new marketing strategy. And it's happening again today, and that's why I want you to know this history, and I'll get to that. So I want to read you one brief passage from the book about what happened to the food industry after McGovern and this re-engineering of American food that really begins right around then. In the years following the 1977 dietary goals and the 82 ones I mentioned, the industry set about re-engineering thousands of popular food products to contain more of the nutrients that science and government had deemed the good ones and fewer of the bad. A golden age for food science dawned. Hyphens sprouted like dandelions in the supermarket aisles. Low fat, no cholesterol, high fiber. Ingredient labels on formerly 2 or 3 ingredient foods such as mayonnaise and bread and yogurt ballooned with lengthy lists of new additives, what in a more benighted age would have been called adulterants. Another thing that happened is that there was a rule that you weren't allowed to simulate products. You had to call them imitation. If you made a no-fat sour cream that had no cream in it, you had to call it imitation sour cream. But they got that thrown out in the 70s, so you have all these synthetic products. The year of eating oat bran, also known as 1988, served as a kind of coming out party for the food scientists who succeeded in getting the material into nearly every processed food sold in America. Oat bran's moment on the dietary stage didn't last long, but the pattern now was set. And every few years since then, a new oat bran has taken its star turn under the marketing lights. Here come omega-3s. You would not think that common food animals could themselves be rejiggered to fit nutritionist fashion, but in fact some of them could be and were in response to the 1977 guidelines, as animal scientists figured out how to breed leaner pigs and select for leaner beef. With widespread lipophobia taking hold of the human population, countless cattle lost their marbling, and lean pork was repositioned as the new white meat. Tasteless and tough as running shoes, perhaps. I mean, I've read that about how it tastes. But now even a pork chop could compete with chicken as a way for eaters to reduce their saturated fat intake. In the years since then, egg producers figured out a clever way to redeem even the disreputable egg. By feeding flaxseed to hens, they could elevate levels of omega-3 fatty acids in the yolks. Aiming to do the same thing for pork and beef fat, the animal scientists are now at work genetically engineering omega-3 fatty acids into pigs and persuading cattle to lunch on flaxseed in the hope of introducing the blessed fish fat where it had never gone before, into hot dogs and hamburgers. But these whole foods are the exceptions. The typical whole food has much more trouble competing under the rules of nutritionism, if only because something like a banana or avocado can't quite as readily change its nutritional stripes. Though rest assured, the genetic engineers are hard at work on this problem. To date, at least, they can't put oat bran in a banana or omega-3s in a peach. So depending on the reigning nutritional orthodoxy, the avocado might either be a high-fat food to be carefully avoided, old think, or a food high in monounsaturated fat to be embraced, new think. The fate and supermarket sales of each whole food rises and falls with every change in the nutritional weather, while the processed foods simply get reformulated and differently supplemented. That's why when the Atkins diet storm hit the food industry in 2003, bread and pasta got a quick redesign, dial back the carbs, boost the proteins, while poor, unreconstructed potatoes and carrots were left out in the carbohydrate cold. A handful of lucky whole foods has recently gotten the good nutrient marketing treatment. The antioxidants in the pomegranate, a fruit formerly more trouble to eat than it was worth, I think you'll agree about that, now protects against cancer and erectile dysfunction. Now, they haven't marketed that advantage, but they have done the research, and they're just trying to figure out how do you get that across to the public. And they got in a lot of trouble, actually, for the research. There were animal rights protests of the palm company that does all this pomegranate research, because apparently they were testing this idea that pomegranates help with erectile dysfunction on rabbits. Now, did you think they had that problem? And this was very upsetting to the animal rights community, so they're not sure if they're going to release this information, but they've proven it. A whole subcategory of nutritional science funded by industry and remarkably reliable in its ability to find a health benefit in whatever food it has been commissioned to study, has sprung up to give a nutritionist sheen and FDA-approved health claim to all sorts of foods, including some not ordinarily thought of as healthy. The Mars Corporation recently endowed a chair in chocolate science. I'm not kidding, this is at my university, at the University of California at Davis, where research on the antioxidant properties of cacao is making steady breakthroughs, so it shouldn't be long before we see chocolate bars bearing FDA-approved health claims. When we do, nutritionism will surely have entered its Baroque phase. Yet, as a general rule, it's a whole lot easier to slap a health claim on a box of sugary cereal than on a raw potato or a carrot, with the perverse result that the most healthful foods in the supermarket sit there quietly in the produce section, silent as stroke victims, while a few aisles over in cereal, the Cocoa Puffs and Lucky Charms are screaming their newfound whole grain goodness to the rafters. Watch out for those health claims. So, thank you. Thank you very much. So this is what nutritionism has given us, this really bizarre food landscape. Now, I could live with nutritionism if it really worked, if it made us healthy. But it's had this tremendous test in our society, and that test is called the low-fat campaign, this re-engineering of the American food system to engineer out the fat. And what has happened since? Well, nutritionism really takes over, as I said, late 70s. The obesity epidemic really begins around 1980. And in fact, the low-fat campaign correlates perfectly with the rise of obesity and type 2 diabetes. That strikes me as a public health disaster. I mean, in a real example of the law of unintended consequences. Now, how could this be? How could driving the fat from our diet make us so fat? Well, two possible explanations present themselves. One is the science on which it was based was not very good. And that may well be true. The other is, though, as I said earlier, as soon as you demonize one nutrient, like fat, you've got to eat something. So you're giving a free pass to another nutrient. And what happened in America is, as we started eating all this no-fat, low-fat food, we moved over and ate lots of carbohydrates, which we had been told were better for us. The American Heart Association will put its stamp on any product as long as it doesn't have fat in it, no matter how much sugar is in it. And so, you know, soda is, guess what, is no fat. And lots of baked goods are no fat. And pasta is no fat. And we had this, what I refer to as the Snackwells phenomenon. You remember that line of no-fat junk food? I mean, pardon me if there are any people from Nabisco here, but it was, you know, there was a moment there in the 80s when they had as much shelf space as like dog food. I mean, it was just miles of Snackwell's products and cookies and crackers, and it was all no fat. And people basically had this idea that since it was no fat, you know, if one was good for you, a whole box would be even better. And so we binged, we binged on carbohydrates. There is also the fact, though, that the science was never very good. I mean, if you look at it, and I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but I talk in the book about what we really know about fat and heart disease, and it's actually remarkable how little evidence there is. There are exactly 2 studies that purport to show that there's a link between a high saturated fat intake and heart disease. 2 studies. A great many more studies do not find any such link. There is a link between saturated fat intake and cholesterol, and there is a link between cholesterol and heart disease. But you can't, you see, go from one to the other, because we don't know whether cholesterol is a cause or a symptom of heart disease. So anyway, it all gets a little complex, but the science is sketchy on fat and heart disease. And increasingly, we're learning that carbohydrates contribute to heart disease, refined carbohydrates in particular, which do get turned into fat, as we discovered, by the liver. But doing the science is really hard. Nutritional science might be one of the hardest kinds of science to do. So I'm very sympathetic for the nutritionists, because it's very hard to study the impact. There's no placebo, right? If you want to study broccoli, you know whether you're eating broccoli or not. There's no broccoli placebo. There's no meat placebo. So actually testing, and as soon as you take one thing out of the diet, you've got to replace it with something. So is the effect you're observing the result of the removal of something or the addition of something else? We don't know. And all these big nutritional studies you read about in the papers, the nurses' health study, the women's health study, what you need to understand is they're all based on something called the Food Frequency Questionnaire, which is to say, every year they ask the women in the study, tens of thousands of women, hundreds of thousands of women, what did you eat last year? What did you eat over the last 3 months? Now, you should go online, download a food frequency questionnaire, and fill it out. And as soon as you do, you will realize that the data on which these large conclusions are based is a little sketchy. I'll give you an example. There is a question on the food frequency. I filled one out. Here's a question from the food frequency. And think about how you would answer this. Over the past 3 months, how often did you eat a half-cup portion of okra, squash, or yams? Half-cup part, can you picture that? And when you did, were they fried in stick margarine, tub margarine, butter, shortening, olive oil, canola, or nonstick spray? I don't remember. And for the okra or yams or squash that I ate in a restaurant, I have no idea what they were fried in. The nutritionists know that the data accumulated by food frequency questionnaires is off. They know it's not perfect. You know how much it's off by? Between 20 and 30%, okay? So it's really bad data. The only thing people lie more about to survey researchers than food is sex. And this information is just not good. So that's a big problem. But there are all the scientific problems of studying it. So I think we have to understand that nutrition science, which I find fascinating and I read as much of as I can, we all need to take with a big grain of something healthier than salt. And we need to understand that nutrition science, as promising as it may be, they may figure all these questions out, but today, when we have to make our eating decisions, nutrition science is approximately where surgery was in the year 1650. It's a young science, okay? Now think back. 1650, are you ready to have surgery, elective surgery? I don't think so. But we are all letting this imperfect science guide us in our eating decisions. Now, where does that leave us? How do we eat, knowing how much we don't know? Well, there is one or two things we do know, and I just want to very briefly say what those are. Two very important things. And one we have known since the turn of the last century, and that is that this thing called the Western diet, that all of us, by and large, are eating, a diet characterized by lots of refined grains, white flour, sugar, lots of refined oils, lots of processed food, lots of meat, lots of calories, lots of everything except fresh fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. That diet, we have known for more than 100 years, reliably produces chronic disease. Heart disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, stroke, and about between 33 and 40% of cancers can be laid at the door of that diet. That what we don't know, and what all these arguments are about, is what in that diet is the problem. And that's what the scientists will be fighting about for a long time. But we know the big fact. That diet gives you these diseases. Okay? Nobody disagrees about that. But also nobody talks about it. And I think that that's a big problem. It's much more convenient to talk about nutrients. And it's the way doctors and scientists think. This is their vocabulary. So that's one thing we know. The other thing we know is that people not eating the Western diet, people eating traditional diets, before the Western diet arrived, did not have these chronic diseases, by and large, but that the variety of traditional diets on which people have been healthy in this world is incredibly diverse. We truly are omnivores. You can find populations living on the Maasai warriors, some of the healthiest people on earth in Africa, living on cattle blood, beef, and milk, and nothing else. And then you can find people, Native Americans in Central America, subsisting essentially on beans and rice, hardly anything else, very healthy. You can find Inuit, Eskimos, subsisting on seal blubber and lichens, and nothing else. Now that's not a American Heart Association approved diet. Pure fat, 24/7. They're healthy. They don't get fat. They don't get type 2 diabetes. Why is that? Maybe it's the omega-3s. Nobody really knows. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that we are, as creatures, adapted to so many different diets that whatever nature gives us, wherever we happen to live, in 6 of the 7 continents, we have found a diet that keeps us whole and healthy. The one diet to which we appear very poorly adapted is the Western diet. What an achievement for a civilization to create the one diet that reliably makes people sick. But this is what we have done over the last 50, 100 years. So these are the 2 big things we know. There is no one diet. Don't let anyone tell you that there is one diet and you must eat this way. There are many, many different ways to eat. But we also have to deal with the fact that the most prevalent way, the Western diet, is a problem. Now, the Western diet, it's what we're eating, and one of 2 things are going to happen. We are either going to get used to it, and perhaps we'll evolve a tolerance for it, although it will take many, many generations and a great deal of suffering and pain and expense before that happens. We are probably evolving to tolerate this diet as we speak. People prone to obesity in their 20s are probably not living as long and probably not reproducing as much as people who can tolerate this. But this, it seems to me, is a really unfortunate course for us to take. We are right now at a fork in the road. We can either medicalize this problem, turn type 2 diabetes into a growth industry, turn treating of chronic disease into a growth industry, become the Lipitor nation, become the nation where on every street corner in the inner city next to the payday loan store is a dialysis center. And we are very quickly moving to that eventuality, where diabetic living is a magazine sold at the supermarket. It becomes another demographic niche for marketers. That's one path, and that is, make no mistake, the path we're on. Or we can do something more economical, more practical, more beautiful, and that is to change the way we eat, to get off the Western diet to the extent that we can. And now that seems really, really hard, but in fact, it's fairly simple. And so what I tried to do in the last third of this book was offer some very simple tips for eating. This was one of those subjects that the deeper I went in as a journalist, normally when I burrow down into a subject, I realize things are much more complicated than I thought, and I'm ambivalent, and the subject's ambiguous, and you can't say anything, it's not black and white. The deeper I got into nutrition and nutrition science, the simpler it got. And after a year of research, I was left with 7 words. It all came down to 7 words, which I gave away on the cover of this book. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. If you will do that, you will be on your way to getting off of the Western diet. Now, the hard part, of course, is eat food. I thought I was eating food. And this is, thank God, I promised my publisher 60,000 words, and I couldn't just give them 7. But it did take some words to help people distinguish between food and what increasingly has come to take over the restaurants and stores where we shop, which are what I call edible food-like substances. An edible food-like substance is something that people were not eating 100 years ago or 150 years ago, that is a highly processed creation of food science, that is something you probably couldn't make at home even if you tried. And so how do you tell them apart? Well, I tried to boil it down to some very simple rules of thumb. For example, and I'll just offer a few of these and then take some questions. Don't eat anything your grandmother or great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. Imagine she is with you in the supermarket as you're rolling down the aisles, and she picks up that box of Go-Gurt portable yogurt tubes, and she pulls one out of the box, and it looks like a toothpaste tube, and like, how do you get this in your body? Is this food? And then she looks at the ingredients, and she knows that yogurt's a very simple food. It's essentially milk and a little bacteria that gives you yogurt. So what are these 15 other ingredients doing there? These colorings, these preservatives, these texturizers. And that brings up another rule. Don't eat any foods that have more than 5 ingredients. That will help you tell the difference. Don't eat any foods that the ingredient label includes high fructose corn syrup. Not because high fructose corn syrup is intrinsically more bad for you than sugar. It may well not be, but it's a marker of a highly processed food. I mean, who do you know who cooks with high fructose corn syrup at home? I can't think of anybody. So that's a marker. And then I suggest, where do you find real food and avoid edible food-like substances? Well, if you shop the perimeter of the store, by and large, the food that has been least fiddled with over the last 75 years by the food scientists is always on the perimeter. And there's a good reason for that. It's perishable. It's alive, so it will die. And so they need to restock those shelves more often than the ones in the middle of the store, where all the food that lasts for years lurks. And, you know, I used to have this Twinkie that I had as a prop in 2006 when I was talking about my last book, Omnivore's Dilemma. And I kept it on my shelf in my office, and every few weeks or months when I was distracted on the phone, I would just reach over and give it a little squeeze. And 2 years in, this thing was as spongy and soft as the day I bought it. That's quite an achievement of food science. And then I thought, well, what does that mean? Well, when food goes bad, by and large what that means is that these microbes we share this planet with have gotten to it, right? The bacteria, the fungi, the insects. So a food that doesn't go bad means they're not interested in it. It has no nutritional value to them. They're still in touch with their nutritional instincts, I think is what it says. So that brought up another rule. Don't eat any food that won't eventually rot. Honey being the notable exception. They found honey in the Great Pyramids and it was fine. It's an exception to every one of my rules, like most good rules in life. And I also developed some rules, though. You know, all right, so that's eat food, not too much. Now, this really is the hard part for most of us, I think. We have this food culture around us. David Kessler's written a very good book about this that's designed to appeal to us, to manipulate us. All the food is engineered to press our evolutionary buttons. The servings are tremendous. I'm really struck. And in Florida, by the way, they're bigger than anywhere else in the country. The size of the plates and how much food is piled on it is truly impressive. But other cultures have navigated abundance before we have. There are ways to do it. The Japanese have a saying, hara hachibu. It means eat until you are 80% full. It's kind of a strange Japanese idea. I mean, how do you know you're at the 80% mark? Unless you've gone all the way and doubled back. So you have to overeat once, and then you'll remember where that 80% mark is. But many other cultures I've since found have similar rules. Germans say you must tie off the sack before it's full, because if you fill a sack too much, you can't close it. My own grandfather used to say, I always like to leave the table a little bit hungry, no matter how much he'd eaten. And so, you know, we have to look at how other cultures have navigated abundance. Portion size is big. I mean, one explanation for the French paradox is that look how much of these lethal foods they're eating. Very small amounts. The French look for food experience rather than food quantity. And when you think about it, it really is experience you're after when you're eating. It's not mass. And so they have figured out how small amounts of very high quality food is more satisfying than large amounts of second-rate food, which is basically the American approach. So anyway, I have a whole lot of rules about that. And one is, you know, don't eat in the car. Where Americans increasingly, we're eating about 20% of our food in the car. That's not, and what kind of food do you eat in the car? It has to be convenience processed food by and large. Don't buy your food where you buy your gas. You will not find anything good there. It's corn products in both cases. It's ethanol for your car and high fructose corn syrup for your stomach. You know, eat meals with other people. When we eat with other people, that moderates our appetites. Think about how thoughtlessly you can eat in front of the television set. My son, who was a notoriously bad eater, whenever I wanted him to eat vegetables, I would just give him a plate of them raw in front of the TV. And without even knowing what he had done, he would eat an entire plate of peas or string beans. Thoughtless eating is really the enemy of controlling appetite. So anyway, I have a whole bunch of rules about that. And I'm collecting more rules. And if you have any good rules that were handed down, because my premise here is that culture has great wisdom about food. It probably has more wisdom than science. And we have denigrated culture. My mother knew all along that butter was better for you than margarine. Nevertheless, she served us margarine because that was the wisdom. That was what she was being told. That was the public health message. And the whole time she did it, she would say, they're going to find out someday that butter's better for you than margarine. And we thought that was crazy. That was an old wives' tale. But of course she was right. Margarine turned out to be much worse for you than butter. Now they've re-engineered margarine. I don't know where it stands now. They've gotten the trans fats out of it by and large. But the point is, culture is a great font of wisdom that we ignore to our peril. So I'm trying to collect these food rules. And if you have any, I've set up an email address, foodrules@michaelpollan.com. Please send me your rules. And I'm trying to make a compendium, partly to help doctors, because a lot of doctors said that, I really like the language you're using to talk about nutrition. I don't have time to go into a whole nutritional discussion with my patients. It would be really great to have a few very simple rules of thumb. Now, something's going on right now in the culture, which is there is a counteroffensive from the food industry in response to the kinds of criticisms that people like me have been making. You've seen all these new products engineered not to have high fructose corn syrup. Coca-Cola is introducing new, improved sugared Coke. Snapple has gotten rid of the high fructose corn syrup. This is not a good development. What this means is when you start advertising that your product has no high fructose corn syrup, you are implicitly claiming that sugar is healthy. And they're getting away with this. There is an implicit health claim showing up now on soda. So their cleverness, their ability to turn any criticism into another marketing strategy is a real challenge. The other thing that's happening is, have you seen Haagen-Dazs has a new five-ingredient ice cream? It's called Five. It doesn't really change. It's ice cream, okay? It's a special occasion food. It doesn't make it a health food because it meets the 5 threshold. And there's an ad for Tostitos chips where this woman goes into the store and she's going to have a party and she picks up a bag of Cheetos or something and says, oh, 13 ingredients. That's more than I have guests coming to my party. And she puts it back. And then she grabs the Tostitos corn chips. Oh, only 3 ingredients. Great. Health food. So I need another way to get at this because my rules are already, obsolete. And I've come up with one. And that is, since these are all advertising campaigns, simply don't buy any food you ever see advertised. Because only 6% of all advertising budgets for food go to real foods, fruits and vegetables and things like that. 94% goes to highly processed food. So if you've seen an ad for it on TV, pass it by. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we could listen to you all night, but we also want an opportunity for those of us in the audience to ask some questions. So we have a mic. If you want to raise your hand, we'll come to you.
Yeah, I was wondering, you sort of broached the subject a little bit, if you could, it's more of a request than a question, but if you could talk about ideas of social justice and how that relates to food, not including environmentalism, not including concepts of global warming, but more, I mean, you talked a little bit about Coca-Cola, and I know that they basically steal a lot of water from a lot of poor people. So if you could just talk more about that subject and sort of for people who don't care quite so much about their health, like young people who eat lots of processed foods.
Yeah, well, you should though. I know that's true. I mean, young people are much more engaged by the ethical and political implications of our eating choices, and those are profound. And in a sneaky way, this is a very political book, because my premise is that you reach people by talking to them about their health, and that as it happens, the best choices for your health advance the kind of agenda you're talking about. getting people off of food being sold by big corporations, getting people to cook for themselves rather than let corporations cook for them who don't do it very well. And that, my goal, in a way, this book is a very kind of gentle invitation to join the movement that's reforming our food system. Because when I found that the best choices for your health were also the best choices for the environment, I was very heartened. There aren't too many areas of life where that works out so well, and that also the best choices happen to be the tastiest choice, the best quality choice. There's very little trade-off. The one trade-off, and this is a social justice issue, is that eating well, eating healthy, fresh, local food costs more. And we have a system in this country that favors processed food. We heavily subsidize the growing of only 5 crops: soy, corn, cotton, rice, and wheat. 4 of them being food crops. Those are the soy and the corn are the building blocks of processed food. That is why fast food is so cheap, that you can get a meal for a couple bucks at McDonald's, because the raw ingredients are heavily subsidized by our tax dollars. So one of the social justice issues that needs to be addressed is figuring out a way to make the healthiest calories in the supermarket more competitive with the unhealthy. We know if you have $1 to spend and you go into a supermarket and you're poor, you're on food stamps, you are looking for calories to keep your family going. You will gravitate toward the middle of the store because you can get about 1,250 calories of chips, of snack food. You can get a lot of pure energy for $1. Whereas if you go to the produce section, you can only get 250 calories of carrots. We do nothing to help the carrot growers. We do nothing to encourage the corn and bean farmers to grow some real food that we can eat. So that's part of the political agenda. As much as those of us with money can vote with our forks for another food system, and that's really what I'm talking about, we're also going to have to vote with our votes for a new agricultural policy. And there are some signs of movement in that direction that are very encouraging. This movement is growing very fast, and we have the ear of the government. And I think Obama's plan for healthcare reform involves a heavy dose of prevention. I think he understands very well that you're not going to tackle healthcare costs unless you address the American food system. And hopefully he will have the stomach to do that.
Good evening. I work as a home health nurse, and I'm consistently appalled by what I see in people's refrigerators and freezers and in their pantries. And I'm wondering if some potential improvement in the medical system or budgeting for this is in the offing. Is it possible to get Medicare or Medicaid to approve paying for cooking lessons, paying for grocery shopping lessons, paying to teach the people who really need to learn how to eat how to do this?
Those are all great ideas, and I actually think they are in prospect. There is some proposals going around to give corporations ways to incentivize, as they say, better eating choices. I don't know how they would work, but people are definitely beginning to think this way. And that teaching people to cook, I'm really glad you brought up that point, because what really makes us victims of this food industry is the fact that we don't cook very much anymore. Half of our food dollars now go to food cooked outside the home. And unless we are not really going to get a handle on this process, unless we rebuild a culture of cooking in this country, it's really key. It's the only way to take back control of your diet, realistically. Could we have healthier processed food? Yeah. No question. They can go some distance. But there is a fundamental conflict between the business model of the food industry and our biological needs. You make money in food by taking cheap raw ingredients, corn and soy and wheat, processing them as much as you can, adding convenience, adding shelf life, adding interesting packaging and novelty, the science of flavor and smells. You make money the more processing you do. Yet the more you process food, the less nutritious it becomes. And then you try to add back in nutrients that you've taken out with fortification. But the real question is whether fortification works. So the answer really is simpler food. And the industry makes less money on simple food. So I honestly don't know what to say when and if Unilever comes to me or General Mills and says, we want to be part of the solution. What should we do? I don't know exactly how I would answer that question. I have a few negative things I would say. I mean, like, no, stop marketing your food to kids who can't make a good judgment. I mean, as with tobacco, we should not allow companies to market food to kids under 8 or 6, and definitely not market it with toys. I mean, that seems really insidious. But after that, it gets really hard because their business model is so invested in processing.
Michael, I know that you're a food detective, and I have a question about cheese and the different types of cheese. I know what we do to cows, the hormones that we give them. What about sheep and goats? Is there as much additives given to those animals?
That's a really interesting question. I'll be honest and say I don't know for sure. There is no equivalent of bovine growth hormone, though, for sheep, and my guess is we don't, and I'll tell you why. It's such a small business that Monsanto is not investing research into how to get goats to overproduce the way they did with cattle. So my guess is it's a good place to avoid hormones, is in eating those alternative cheeses. It's just not a big enough business yet. Good question, though. I'll confirm that, but my sense is not a problem.
This omnivore's dilemma, sometimes at the grocery store, I'm conflicted. Do I buy locally? Our growing season is during the winter, and we have great produce that comes in, or organically, where it's coming probably from Mexico or Central and South America, which affects the carbon footprint. You know, you want to support the local growers, but with knowing the pesticides are being applied, what's the better option?
Well, that's a hard one. I mean, you know, I'm often asked the question, you know, organic or local. I tend to favor local. I think it supports more values that matter to me. There's no one answer, though. It really depends on what values you have. If you're really concerned about pesticide residue, and that's your thing, then organic is the label, because you can rest assured that if it's organic food, it has no synthetic pesticide residues, or very, very little that drifted from some neighboring field. As concerned as I am about that, though, I'm also concerned about local agriculture because of preserving landscape. I really like food when it's really fresh. I like having farmers in my community, so I like supporting the farmers market in my town. We're very lucky in Berkeley. Our farmers market is open 50 weeks of the year, and it's full of food the whole time. So I think, and also in general, local producers, if they're diversified, if they're growing more than one thing, will tend not to be using a lot of pesticides. You only need lots of pesticides when you have vast monocultures. So if you're buying from a local farm and he or she has got 20 crops or 30 crops, you can rest assured you're not getting pesticide-laden food. So, you know, I hate to tell people that's the right answer. You have to think through what values do you want to support, what really matters to you. And the carbon footprint is a very important value, and I agree. And organic didn't think about that. You have to remember the organic rules are a snapshot in time. They were written in the 1990s, before climate change was a high priority. So that they considered it organic to, you know, grow and wash a lettuce in the Salinas Valley and drive it across the country to Coral Gables, even though, so it's kind of good for the land in the Salinas Valley, but the carbon footprint of that lettuce, you know, it's taken 55 calories of fossil fuel to deliver 1 calorie of food to your plate. So in some deep sense, that's not organic.
We have time for one more question for now.
Hello. For the past 2 decades now in America, the majority of Americans have been eating genetically modified organisms, and most people don't even know what they are. But basically, to sum it up, it's taking like animal genes and shoving it into our food genetically. So most Americans don't know that they're eating that, and it's partly because of the FDA ruling that they don't have to be labeled as GMOs. Is there a reason why you didn't mention that much about GMOs in your book, and how do you feel about that?
Well, the reason I didn't talk a lot about GMOs in this book is I wrote about it extensively in an earlier book. I think it's an important issue. I think we are entitled to know if the food we're eating contains genetically modified ingredients, so people who don't want to eat them don't have to. And 90% of Americans agree. It's not a controversial position. What's remarkable is that only about 10 congressmen are willing to sign on to such a law. Monsanto is a very powerful company, and they have friends on both sides of the political aisle. So they have succeeded in keeping this out of view. Genetically modified food is a complex issue. We are eating it, you're right. It's in about 70% of processed foods. If you are eating whole foods, however, in the produce section, by and large, you are not eating genetically modified food. There's some genetically modified papaya, but that's basically it. Basically because the industry knows that people would rather not eat it, and it's easier to hide it in in corn and soy products. There's no genetically modified wheat because our farmers said we don't want it. They have not proven any kind of health risks to genetically modified food, but we should take no comfort in that whatsoever because they have not tested it. Not very much. I mean, any test Monsanto has about health effects have been about basically testing for allergenicity in a test tube. Feeding studies on rats, as you might expect, no, hasn't happened. Feeding studies on people, no. And you're not allowed as an independent scientist to study this. In fact, just 2 months ago, a group of crop scientists wrote a letter of protest to Monsanto saying, you're not allowing us to study this, because when you buy their seeds, you sign a form that says you will not conduct research, and if you do, we get the right to prior approve or reject the research you come up with. So there is a gag rule on studying these crops. So what I'm saying is no health risks have been proven, but the science has not been done freely and openly. In the meantime, you know, where we should stand is for transparency, the right to know what we're eating. We should also know where food comes from. And I think it's a very important part of this movement is fight for transparency of food. But if you're eating local food, if you're eating from the produce section, or if you're eating from the edge of the store, by and large, you're avoiding genetically modified food. Thank you so much. I'll be outside, or I'll be back here signing books. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you.